The first hard cold of the winter found Lydia Weir with a handful of kindling, a cabin that let the wind through its north wall like it was not there, a boy of 6, and nothing else in the world. She had a hard-scrabble quarter section up in the high country above Frost Hollow that her husband Reuben had bought on hope and worked on stubbornness, and left her, a year in the ground, with the hope worn out and the stubbornness gone into the grave with him. By the second week of the freeze, she had burned the last of her kindling, and then a shelf, and then the legs of a chair, and she was lying in the one bed with her son Jem wrapped tight against her, doing the arithmetic every widow in that country ends up doing in the dark sooner or later, which is how many days 2 people can last on nothing, and which of the 2 of them is likely to last the longer. She had been too proud all that long year to tell a living soul how thin it had gotten. She had let the folk of Frost Hollow believe she was managing, because the asking felt like the last thing she owned that was still hers to keep. And so nobody in that whole cold county knew that the Weir place was down to its bones, and a boy and a woman inside it, slowly going out like a banked fire nobody was feeding. Nobody but Josiah Hart, who ranched the next place down the valley, and who, since his own wife died, had fallen into the habit of a lonely man, which was to notice things. He noticed the weather and the stock and the light in his neighbor's windows of an evening, because a house with a lamp in it was a house with somebody alive and warm inside, and after 2 years of a cold hearth, he had learned to take a strange comfort in the sight. And on a bitter blue morning in the deep of that freeze, he stood at his own fence with his coffee going cold in his hand, and looked up the valley at the Weir cabin, and saw that it stood dark and still, no smoke off the chimney, no track broke in the snow around it, no lamp the night before. Now that he thought back on it, and none the night before that, a cabin gone dark and cold in that country in that weather means one of 2 things. And Josiah Hart found he could not stand at his own warm fence and drink his own hot coffee and not go up there and learn which of the 2 it was. He rode up through snow to his horse's chest, half a mile that took him the better part of an hour, and when he got there, the door was frozen fast in its frame, and no knock brought anyone, and he put his shoulder to it and broke it in. He found them in the one bed under everything they owned, the widow and the boy, gray in the face and blue at the lips, and slow to answer. The inside of the cabin colder than the yard, because a house with no fire pulls the cold in and holds it. He wrapped the 2 of them in every blanket he had thought to bring, and got them up onto the horse, and walked the animal back down the valley with his own coat over the both of them, and he carried them into his house and laid them by a fire he built up until it roared. The doctor, when the roads let him come 3 days later, looked at them and said another night in that cabin would have finished it, and maybe not even the whole of a night. When Lydia Weir came all the way back to herself, it was in a warm bed in a warm room, with her boy sleeping sound beside her, and the color come back into his face, and a big quiet man across the room feeding a good fire and pretending, being the kind of man he was, not to see that she had woken. She understood in one long terrible moment that she had been an hour, maybe less, from lying dead in a snowed-in cabin with her dead son in her arms, and no one the wiser till the thaw, and that a man she had barely spoken 10 words to in a year had come through 4 feet of snow to carry her out of it. And she wept then, from the shame of it and the relief of it both at once, which are closer kin than people like to admit. And Josiah Hart kept his back to her, and fed his fire, and let her. She tried to leave the first day she could stand. She got herself and the boy bundled, and got as far as the door out of pure pride and pure shame, the 2 things that had nearly killed her. And Josiah looked up from the hearth and said, mild as new milk, that the cabin up the hill still had no fire in it, and no roof worth the name, and 4 feet of snow on the trail between here and there, and that she was welcome to go and freeze in it on principle if her pride truly required it of her, but that she would be leaving the boy by his fire while she did, because he would not stand by and let a child die to spare a grown woman her feelings. It was said kindly, and it was said without heat, and there was no answering it. And Lydia Weir, who had spent a whole year refusing every hand held out to her in that country, sat back down at a stranger's fire, beaten by plain sense, and by a warmth she had half forgotten a body could feel. Being cared for sat strangely on her. It fit like a coat cut for a bigger woman, and it took her the better part of a month to stop flinching every time it touched her, and a good while longer than that to stop lying awake waiting for the bill to come due. At the head of Josiah Hart's table stood a chair that no one sat in. It had been Rebecca's, his wife, 2 winters gone, and in the 2 winters since they had put her in the ground, the family had gone on eating their meals around it, and no one, not the man and not his 2 children, had ever once taken that seat, so that the empty chair sat at the head of every supper like a 4th silent person at the board. The house had been that way in every room since Rebecca died, warm at the stove and cold everywhere else, a grieving man and 2 children learning to live around an absence the shape of a person. The boy was Micah, 9 years old, gone hard and quiet, the way a boy will who has decided that wanting things is what got him hurt. And the girl was Bess, 6, who cried in the nights for a mother she was young enough to be forgetting and old enough to know she had lost. When Lydia took her place at that table those first weeks, she took a stool at the side and would not be moved to the empty chair, though there was no other proper seat, because some things a person will not do even half dead and beholden, and sitting in a dead woman's chair at the head of a dead woman's table was one of them. The talk began before she was well enough to sit up for a full meal, because Frost Hollow was a small world, and a small world runs on exactly this: a young widow taken into a widower's house, his wife not 2 years cold, the 4 of them and his children shut up together for the length of a mountain winter. Mrs. Pruitt was the first to make the ride out, the moment the road broke enough to allow a buggy, and she came full of concern arranged to look like kindness, all of it about how it looked. A woman living there, the impropriety of it, what people were bound to say, and surely something more seemly could be arranged. A spare corner in town, anywhere at all, that was not a widower's home. Josiah Hart heard her the whole way out, standing on his own porch with his hat in his hand, and when she had finished, he said the thing that settled it in that country for good. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said, "3 mornings back I broke a frozen door off its hinges and pulled that woman and her little boy out of a bed they had lain down in to die, the both of them an hour from gone, in a valley full of good church-going people, not one of whom thought to ride up and check why a widow's chimney had gone cold. She has got no wood, no money, and no place up that hill that will not kill her before the thaw. So she is stopping here by my fire where it is warm, and her boy with her, until the spring, and not 1 day before it. I have got an empty chair at my table and food enough to fill the plate in front of it, and there is a woman and a child who would be under the snow without them. And I do not care who talks." He said it level, without a scrap of heat in it, which is what made it land the way it did. "You can carry that back to Frost Hollow word for word," he said. "A man who would let a widow and a boy freeze to keep his own name clean has got no name worth the keeping, and I would sooner be talked about every day of my life than wake up one morning and find I had become that man." Mrs. Pruitt rode back to town with her message, and the valley talked, and Josiah Hart went on not caring, and Lydia stayed. If this one is warming you tonight, stay by the fire with me to the end of it, and tell me down in the comments what part of the world you are listening from. I read everyone. Her own boy took to the house faster than she did, the way the small ones do. Jem was 6 and had spent a year being the only warm thing in a cold cabin, holding himself still so as not to be one more trouble to a mother who had trouble enough. And here of a sudden were 2 other children, and a barn full of stock, and a big slow man who answered a boy's questions, as though they were worth the answering. Inside, a month, Jem and Micah were thick as two thieves, in the way of children who have each buried a parent and found in one another the one person who does not need it, explained to them. Bess trailed the pair of them everywhere they went, and the table that had sat too quiet for 2 years, the empty chair at the head of it, and the grief banked all around, got loud again by slow degrees. 3 children now, where there had been 2, until some suppers Josiah had to raise his voice to be heard over his own board, and Lydia would catch him not minding it in the least. A man learning again the sound of a full table after a long time of the other kind of table entirely. She earned her keep that winter the only way her pride would allow her to, which turned out to be the saving of the whole house. For Lydia, Weir was a needlewoman, a true one, the rare kind, who could take a bolt of plain cloth or a pile of worn-through cast-offs and cut and stitch them into a coat so warm and so finely made that it stopped a person in the doorway. And Josiah Hart's house, for all that the stove kept it from freezing, had been a cold place in every other way since Rebecca died, the buttons gone off the children's coats, and the hems let down wrong, and nobody's mittens matched. The small daily warmths of a house that has a mother in it, all gone quiet with her. Lydia could not give those children their mother back, but she could do the thing she did, which was make warmth with her hands, and so she sat up by the fire and she sewed, all that long white winter, and the first warm things she made for Micah and Bess, a good coat apiece, cut down from cloth of her own, and she watched the hard, quiet boy try not to show how it felt to have someone tend to him again, and she let him keep his pride the way a person does who knows the worth of it. And then, in the dead middle of the winter, she did the thing that broke Josiah Hart clean open and made him over. She had gone up into the loft after piecing cloth and found a trunk, and in the trunk were Rebecca's things, folded away 2 years before, by a man who could neither look at them nor let them go, her dresses, her shawl, her good wool cloak, packed into the dark because Josiah had not the heart to use them and had not the heart to give them off. Lydia Weir stood a long time over that open trunk, understanding exactly what it was, and then she went down and asked his leave, gently, and he gave it, not quite knowing what he was giving. And over the following weeks she took Rebecca's dresses, the gray one the children remembered her wearing to church, and the yellow sprigged one she had worn near every day, and the heavy cloak, and she cut them and worked them and lined them and made of them 2 warm winter coats, one for Micah and one for Bess, so that those 2 motherless children could walk out into every cold of their childhood wrapped in their own mother, warm inside the very cloth she had worn, her colors around their shoulders in the wind. And when she gave them, when she put into the arms of that hard, quiet boy and that crying little girl 2 coats made out of their mother's own dresses, and they understood what they were holding, Micah, who had not shed a tear since the day they buried her, put his face down into the gray church cloth that still, somehow, after everything, held the ghost of the way his mother had smelled, and he sobbed like the child he had not been allowed to be in 2 years. And Bess stopped crying in the nights after that, because now when she lay down her mother's cloak was over her, and her mother's arms were around her in the dark. And Josiah Hart walked out to the barn and stood in the cold a long, long time, because the woman his valley was busy naming a scandal had just handed his grieving children back a piece of their mother, that he, in 2 whole years, had known no way to give them but to lock in a box in the loft. "You made my children warm in a way I never learned how to," he told her later, by the fire, when he could get the words up. "Rebecca has been gone 2 years, and I kept her in the dark up there because I could not stand her gone and could not stand her near, and you went up and took her out and made her into a thing that will keep my babies warm every winter they live. I do not have the words for what that is, Lydia." And Lydia Weir, who understood grief from the inside of it, said only that a thing a person cannot bear to look at is still warm cloth and still good, if someone who loves the ones left behind is willing to take up the shears and do the cutting. And Josiah looked at her across his fire for a long moment, and did not say the rest of what was in him, because it was not the winter to say it, and she was not yet free to hear it. The winter went on long past the point where the danger of it had passed, the way the winters do up in that country, and the household settled into a shape none of them had ever sat down and decided on. Josiah took his supper and then mended tack by the fire while Lydia sewed, and the 3 children did their letters on the warm hearthstones, and nobody said a great deal, because there was not a great deal that wanted saying. She had stopped, by then, waiting for the bill to come. She had understood at last that there was never going to be one, that the man had come up her hill and carried her out of the snow and taken her in and asked her for nothing, because that was simply the whole of what he was, and that a debt a person keeps trying to pay off is not a kindness done to them. It is a wound kept open. And Josiah Hart had never once let her feel it as either. It was the safest she had been since Reuben went into the ground, and she was careful all that long winter not to look too hard at why. By the time the roads opened, Lydia Weir's work had become a quiet wonder in that country. The doctor's wife saw the children's coats and had to have one made, and then a rancher's wife, and then it seemed the whole county wanted her, and the scandalous widow up at the Hart place was, of a sudden, the seamstress whose coats you waited a whole season for and paid dear to get, and Lydia Weir had money of her own again, and a name for something good, and a thing that was hers by her own hands, and not by any man's rescue. And the talk should have died away there, and it would have, but for Deacon Harlan Rusk. Rusk was a lean, cold, righteous man of standing in Frost Hollow, an elder of the church, the sort who somewhere along the years had come to mistake the sound of his own disapproval for the voice of the Almighty. He had decided that the Hart household was a standing offense against the decency of the county, and that it had fallen to him to see it cleansed. It did not move him that the woman had been carried out of a frozen grave, nor that she had made warmth for orphan children out of their dead mother's dresses. Those things were sentiment, and Harlan Rusk did not traffic in sentiment. He traded in rules, and the rule was that an unmarried woman had passed a whole winter under an unmarried man's roof, and whatever the facts of it, that was the near neighbor of sin, and he meant to see it named and ended in front of the whole congregation. So he brought it before a meeting of the church and the men of the town, and he moved that Lydia Weir be named in her sin and put out of the county, and that Josiah Hart be censured before them all. And he made his case in the cold, rolling voice of a man who has never once in his life doubted himself, all of it about appearances and example, and the protection of decent homes. Josiah Hart stood up when Rusk had finished, and so did Lydia Weir, up on her feet beside him, which was the one thing Harlan Rusk had not counted on. "Deacon Rusk wants this woman driven out of the county," Josiah said to the room, "for the sin of not having frozen to death quietly enough to spare us all the awkwardness. So let us every one of us be clear on what actually happened, since he has gone and left it out. On the coldest morning of December, I broke down a frozen door and found Lydia Weir and her 6-year-old boy, Blue, in a dead cold bed, with no fire and no food, an hour from 2 fresh graves, in a valley full of good Christian folk, several of them in this room, who never thought to go and look. I carried them to my fire, because the other choice was to bury them at the thaw. She has lived in my house through the winter, and in that time she has made my motherless children warm in body and in heart, and asked me for nothing, and turned a dead woman's dresses into the finest coats this county has ever seen. That is the sin the deacon wants her run off for." He looked around the room, slow. "I will tell you all exactly what I told Mrs. Pruitt back in December, and what I will tell my Maker when my turn comes to answer for my days. A man who would let a widow and a child freeze to keep his good name clean has got no name worth the keeping. I did not care who talked then, and I do not care now. And if the whole price of doing the plain decent thing is Harlan Rusk's disapproval, then I will pay it gladly and count it the cheapest bargain I ever made. And then Lydia Weir spoke, because she had learned that winter that she was a woman who could. I would be dead, Deacon, she said, quiet and clear enough to carry to the back wall. Me and my Jem both, buried up in those hills, and not one of you would have known it until the snow went off in April. Josiah Hart is the only soul in this county who looked. You stand there troubled about how it appeared that a man saved our lives. I will tell you how it appeared to me, lying in that warm bed alive with my living boy beside me. It appeared to be the one plainly Christian thing that anybody in Frost Hollow managed in the whole of that hard month. You may put me out of the county if this meeting votes it, but you will be putting out the woman who would be a frozen corpse right now if your care for how things look had been the thing that came up my hill through the snow. It was not. A man who did not care how it looked came up my hill. That is the whole of the story, and you may make of it what you will. The meeting did not vote her out. The meeting, having for the first time heard the true shape of the thing laid down plain against the deacon's cold abstraction of it, turned hard the other way, because there is nothing a community will turn on faster, once it has been made to see clearly, than a righteous man who would plainly have preferred a frozen widow and a dead child to an arrangement that made him uncomfortable. Harlan Rusk had meant to cast Lydia Weir out, and had instead stood her plain and heroic in front of the whole town, and set himself, plain and cold, right there beside her for the comparing, and the comparison did not go his way. He left that meeting a smaller man than he had walked into it, and he stayed small after, because a town will forgive nearly anything sooner than it will forgive being shown its own coldness. Wearing the face of a child, it had very nearly let die. Josiah Hart married Lydia Weir in the spring, when the thaw had come, and she was free to choose and beholden to no one, which he had waited for on purpose. I told this whole valley in December that I did not care who talked, he said to her on the porch with the snow sliding off the hills, and I have spent a winter proving I meant it, and I find I mean it more with every week that goes by. But I waited to say this until the roads were open, and you could go anywhere on this earth you pleased, back to your own place, or to town, or clean out of this county to somewhere not a soul has ever heard our names, so that you would know I am not asking you because we were snowed in together, and it came easy. I am asking because you walked into a cold, dead house and made it warm all the way through, mine and the children's both. You have got your own fire now, Lydia, your own money, your own good name. You do not need one thing of mine. He looked at her. There is a chair at the head of my table that has stood empty 2 years, and you would not take it all winter, and you were right not to, because a seat like that is not a thing a person ought to be given out of rescue. Take it now, by your own right. Marry me, not for the room, and not for the fire, and not for the roof. Marry me because Micah and Bess have taken to saying their prayers for it out loud, and because somewhere under all that stitching this winter, I stopped being able to picture that table with the head of it empty and your face not there above it. And I still do not care who talks. Only now I would dearly like the talk to be about a wedding. Lydia Weir, who had lain down in a frozen cabin certain that she and her boy were going to die up there, unmissed and unmourned, looked at the man who had come up her hill through 4 feet of snow because he had seen no smoke, and felt the last of that December cold finally go out of her for good. You came up my hill in a blizzard because my chimney had gone cold, she said, when not one other person in these hills had looked twice at me in a year. You gave us your fire and your table, and you did not care who talked, and then you handed me the shears, and let me cut your dead wife's dresses to warm your living children, which is the most trusting thing I have ever known one grieving soul to do for another. I have been warm clear through since about the day you did that, Josiah, and I have been afraid the whole time to call the warmth by its right name. She took his 2 hands in hers. Yes, I will marry you, and I will sit in that chair, and I will fill that table, and I will sew warm coats for your children, and our children, and half this cold county besides, if it will pay me to. And I will be glad every single morning of my life of a man who looked up a valley at a chimney gone cold and rode toward it instead of away. Yes, let them talk. Let them come to the wedding and talk all they like. They married when the last of the snow was going off the high country, and Lydia's coats grew known past 3 counties. And as Bess grew, Lydia set her up at her own side and taught her the needle, and the girl took to it. And Lydia kept always on the seat of her own chair at the head of that table a folded square of plain cloth, the first thing she had ever cut and pieced in that house, not made of Rebecca's dresses, but of her own poor scraps, to keep her in mind of a thing she had learned from both ends of it, that the warmest things in this world are most often made out of what somebody else had already given up as worthless. Micah and Bess walked out into every winter of their growing up wrapped in their mother's own colors, and grew into people who knew they had been loved by 2 mothers, the one who had borne them and the one who had come up out of the snow half dead herself and refused to let them go on cold. And Josiah Hart lived out a long and warm-hearted life at a fireside he never once regretted the sharing of, and told anyone who would sit still to hear it that the best thing he ever did in all his days was to look up a frozen valley at a chimney with no smoke coming off it, and ride toward it instead of away. And that was the story of Lydia Weir, the lonely widow who lay down to die in a forgotten cabin with her boy in her arms, and was carried out of the cold by a man who told a whole talking county he had an empty chair at his table, and did not care one bit who knew it, and who found at that table warmth enough to last her the rest of her days. If this one warmed you tonight, tell me down in the comments where in the world you are listening from. I hope it finds you well, and I will see you by the fire in the next one.